I'm going to show you some basics for working with clay so you can have a ceramics enrichment experience at home. So, we are working with a kind of clay called stoneware clay. And clay is basically like a mud that comes from the ground that has just the right mixture of minerals in it that when you bake it and get it hot enough, it will become permanent like stone. So the first step is making something out of your clay, forming it, and I'll give you more ideas and techniques for that in a minute. And then we let it dry in the air. And once it's completely dry, it gets a little bit lighter in color, and it looks like it's hard and permanent, but it isn't yet. It's dry, but still very brittle and can break when it's just dry. But once it's dry like this, we're ready to put it in the kiln, which is like a big oven, and it gets very hot inside, as hot as a volcano, over 2,000 degrees, and you fire it in that oven, and then it becomes very hard and lighter in color. At this point, we will paint it with things that seem like paints. They're called glazes, and you paint your color on, you fire it a second time in your kiln, and then the glaze comes out in all sorts of shiny colors. They come in many different varieties, and then once you fire it the second time with the glaze, it is done. It is very hard and ready to be displayed in your home. It can go in the garden. It won't absorb moisture anymore. You can make plates and mugs and things you can use in the kitchen. And we will talk more about glazes in another video when you're ready to do that. But first, it's about forming your clay. So let me first go over all the tools that you have in your kit that I've sent home for you. You're going to have a lump of clay in a plastic bag. You will have a cloth mat. This is your work surface. It's important to do all your building on this cloth mat, because if you start building a project directly on a table, it can very often get stuck, and you end up having to ruin your project to get it off of the table. So remember to always work on your cloth mat. You also have a rolling pin. Now this is the one exception for when you don't work on your cloth mat. If you want to roll your clay out into a thin sheet of clay to work with, we call it a slab, it's very hard to roll on the mat because the mat can slide around. So if that is annoying and not working, move your mat for a moment, and you can roll directly on your table surface, and it will become washable, so you don't have to worry about that. Flatten your clay as much as you can with your hands, and then take your rolling pin and push away from you, lifting up after each turn, and then turn your piece to do the other side and roll it to whatever thickness you want. Then you pick it up and put it back on your mat to keep working on your project. So you'll have your mat, you'll have a rolling pin. You will have a wooden stick that's sharp at one end. I'll probably give you a couple different ones because sometimes they break. And this is your cutting tool or scratching tool. You can cut clay, you can scratch designs in clay, you can poke holes in clay. You'll use this for a lot of different things. And you also have a sponge. Now take your sponge, get it wet, and then squeeze it out so it's just damp. You don't want it dripping wet, because wet clay that's too wet does not form very well. Now you use your sponge to smooth out surfaces, but especially to smooth out these sharp lines when you cut clay. Because if you see how ragged this is, once this is fired and permanent, that ragged edge becomes very sharp. So you take your sponge and you smooth out any rough surfaces. And then if your sponge gets too dirty, wash it, squeeze it out again, and you're ready to go. And you also have a brush. Now this brush is going to be used to paint on what we call slip, which is a kind of a glue that you use with clay. You're going to need to make your slip at home, which is very easy. You just take a little bowl or cup of some kind, put in a little lump of the clay that I've given you, and a tiny bit of water, and then take your brush and mix it up, and the clay will get dissolved in there, and it becomes kind of like a murky, milky liquid, which will be your slip. So you want to have your brush and your slip available to you off at the side. Also in your kit, we have a few plastic beads that make cool textures in the clay. You can roll it and it creates a cool line. You can press it down that way and it makes kind of a flower. These with all the little balls, you roll it on there and it makes a bunch of dots. They do all sorts of different things. And these are just a starting point. You can find all sorts of objects around the house that, when pressed into the clay, make cool textures and prints. One thing I especially like to use are leaves from the garden. You can roll those into the clay, and then when you pull them out, they leave really beautiful textures. So there's no limit to interesting textures you can make in clay. So I've included a few of those in your kit, as well as what looks like an old credit card. And this is no longer good at Harrison Hot Springs, but it's perfect for smoothing clay out like that. If you want a nice smooth surface, or cutting through a nice clean line. So this is a handy kind of a tool to have in your kit. And then you also have with your kit just an empty box that you will use when you're all done. You're going to write your name on the side of that box and put your finished project in it to return to me. And there will be instructions with this kit on how to do that. All right, so that's what you have in your kit to get going. So let's talk about just a few important rules for working with clay so that it turns out really well in the end and your project doesn't get ruined by cracking or breaking along the way because you forgot a couple simple rules. So the first is that this clay will dry out over time in the air, and if you're wanting to work with it longer, keep your extra clay that you're not using right at the moment in the plastic bag it came in so it stays moist while you're still working on it. So take out the piece you want and start forming. And a couple things. You don't want a piece to be too thick and solid inside because it won't dry properly and it can crack during firing if it's too thick. So I always say try to make something that is no thicker than about an inch thick. Now there are techniques for making bigger pieces that are hollow inside, so it doesn't mean you can only make small pieces. It just means there's no part of your piece which is really thick. And at the same time, there's no part of your piece that is really, really thin, because that can be brittle when it dries and break off easily. So try to keep your pieces between about an inch thick, inch and a half, and maybe a quarter inch, maybe the thickness of your pinky finger. Try not to get too much thinner than that, and then your piece has a better chance of making it through the firing and drying process. Now, the main technique, which I'm going to teach in this video, is one of the most important for a successful project, and that's when you want to join two pieces of clay together. So right now when the clay is wet, when you push it together, it seems like they're stuck together. But when it dries, these will just fall apart. So you have to attach these in a very specific way, and we call it scratch and attach because it's easy to remember. And that's what you're doing. You're taking your two sides that are ultimately going to go together, and you're going to take your cutting tool and scratch lines on both sides that are going to be joined. And then you take your slip, your brush, dip it in there, and paint on a little of that watery clay just on one side. And then you push together the two pieces and let it dry that way, and then that's going to be permanent. It's like all those little scratches are connecting, and the slip acts as a glue. So scratch and attach. Any time that you are joining two pieces of clay together, you want to make sure you do it properly. If you're adding a little detail on the outside of something, even that can fall off. You want to scratch, put your slip, and attach it on properly. So that's an important rule to remember. Now there's another rule, which is you don't want there to be air bubbles or a big space of air trapped inside clay. So that would mean if you made a hollow form and you closed it up, there's air inside that. Now the air does not shrink, but clay shrinks. As it dries, it gets smaller and shrinks together, and the air inside doesn't. So it will end up cracking your piece as it dries. So the thing to do, if you have any piece form that has air, a hollow of air inside it, you just want to give that a place for the air to escape. A tiny little hole poked in is sufficient to let that air out. It doesn't need to be very big. You can put on a place where you don't see it, but you need to not have air trapped inside your clay. And there's some projects where that happens more easily than others, and I will have other videos with project ideas, and I will go over that rule again. So at this point, you have your tools. You know the couple important techniques: not too thick, not too thin, scratch and attach, and no trapped air. Now you have your lump of clay you can make something with, and there'll be a couple other videos with ideas and techniques for what to make, or you can just start going and make whatever your imagination tells you to make. Then, when it's all done, you will put it in your empty box that I gave you with your name on it and return it to me. So at that point, I will fire it the first time, and then we'll talk about using glazes and putting colors on for the next phase. So always remember, you can text or email me with questions, but that's the basics of this kit for enrichment at home.